On a Tuesday in late October, a 53-year-old woman sat in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons in Sudbury, Ontario, and counted the money in her wallet, $61.40. She counted it twice. Not because she didn't trust her arithmetic, but because her hands had nothing else to do, while her mind refused to accept what the number meant. The coffee in the cup holder had gone cold. Outside, the first real snow of the season was coming down in the kind of slow, indifferent way that northern Ontario snow always comes. Not dramatic, just relentless. Coating the windshield in white until the parking lot disappeared, and Cecile Garneau was the only person left in the world. Her husband of 28 years had been dead for 11 days, and the estate lawyer had called that morning to let her know that the property Roland had left her, the one thing she had expected to sell, to live on, to breathe with, had been assessed by the county at a value of $0. Zero. She said the word out loud in the car, just to hear how it sounded. It sounded exactly as bad as she'd thought. If you've ever loved someone quietly and been quietly misunderstood in return, this story is for you. Stay with us, because what Cecile found in that old mill is going to change the way you think about what a life is worth. And before we go any further, if stories like this one matter to you, we'd love it if you hit subscribe and told us where you're watching from. A single comment is enough to help this channel reach the next person who needs to hear it. Now back to Cecile, sitting alone in that parking lot with $61 and a windshield full of snow. Roland Garneau had not been a complicated man, or so Cecile had believed for most of their marriage. He was a carpenter who smelled of cedar shavings and wood smoke. He was quiet in the way of men who had grown up in small northern towns, where words were expensive, and silence was the currency of real feeling. He had big, red-scared hands and a habit of tilting his head to the right when he was thinking, like a dog hearing a sound just out of range. She had loved that habit once. By the end, she barely noticed it. They had met in their mid-20s, in Sudbury, at a hardware store where Cecile was buying paint for her first apartment, and Roland was replacing a blade on his table saw. He had held the door for her without being asked. That was it. That was the whole beginning of 28 years. For most of those years, Cecile had worked as a medical billing clerk at the regional hospital. She understood numbers. She understood that every dollar had a proper column, and that columns needed to balance. Roland understood wood. He understood grain and joint and tension and the way a piece of pine would tell you, if you listened carefully enough, which way it wanted to bend. The problem was the mill. Thornbury Mill sat on 12 acres outside a town called Eston Creek, 3 hours north of Sudbury. It had been in Roland's family since his grandfather's time, a sawmill that had stopped milling anything in 1987, and had spent the decades since quietly becoming part of the landscape. The roof half-caved, the wheel frozen, the mill pond silted over, the outbuildings sagging under the weight of winters nobody had bothered to count. When Roland's mother died and left it to him, Cecile had suggested they sell it immediately. Roland had said he wanted to think about it. He thought about it for 22 years. And in those 22 years, Roland had driven the 3 hours to Eston Creek every other weekend, sometimes every weekend, leaving on Friday afternoon and returning Sunday evening with sawdust on his boots and a look on his face that Cecile had given up trying to read. She had asked him once early on what he was doing up there. He'd said he was keeping things from falling further. She had thought he meant the roof. She had thought many things about Roland that turned out to be wrong. The arguments about the mill were quiet, the way all their real arguments were quiet. Cecile had learned early in their marriage that Roland did not argue so much as absorb. You could lay out every reasonable point, every financial figure, every logical conclusion, and he would sit at the kitchen table and listen with those river-calm eyes, and then he would say something like, "There are people who need that wood, Cecile," and she would have no answer for it that felt clean enough to use. They had one daughter, Madeline, who lived in Halifax now with her husband and 2 boys. Madeline had inherited Cecile's accounting instincts and Roland's ability to listen, which made her, in Cecile's opinion, the better version of both of them. Madeline had also thought the mill was a money pit, but she said it gently, the way she said most things, and Roland would squeeze her shoulder and nod like she'd confirmed something he already knew. What Cecile had resented, and she knew the word was too large for the feeling, but it was the accurate one, was not the mill itself. It was what the mill represented. Every weekend Roland drove north. That was a weekend the roof of their own house didn't get repainted. Every dollar he put into keeping the mill from collapsing, and she never knew exactly how much, because he handled that account separately, which she had pointed out to him more than once was a form of dishonesty, even if he didn't mean it that way. Was a dollar not put toward the retirement she had been quietly building in her head since the age of 40. She was not a greedy woman. She had never wanted to be rich. She wanted only to be safe, and she had married a man who seemed constitutionally unable to prioritize his own family's safety over a falling-down mill 3 hours away that earned nothing and took everything. That was the marriage, more or less, as Cecile had understood it. Roland had a heart attack on a Wednesday morning in October, alone in the truck, 2 kilometers from the Eston Creek turnoff. The paramedics said he had probably been gone before the truck even rolled to a stop on the shoulder. He was 61 years old, and his boots were on, and there was a thermos of black coffee on the passenger seat, and Cecile had to be told twice before the fact of it reached her. The funeral was in Sudbury. She had expected a modest turnout. They were not social people. They had not collected a large crowd over the years, but there were people at the back of the church she did not recognize, and they stood very still, very quiet, and several of them were crying in the way of people who did not want to be seen crying, but couldn't help it. One man, big and weathered, had come in work boots with dried mud on them, as though he had driven a long way very fast and had not had time to change. He left before Cecile could reach him. She thought about that man for a long time afterward. The estate lawyer's name was Francine Bellumeur. She was past 70, with a small office above a pharmacy in the flour mill neighborhood, the same neighborhood Roland had grown up in, and she smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she kept in her desk drawers. She had been Roland's family's lawyer for 30 years, and she had the particular gentleness of someone who has delivered a great many difficult truths to people who were not prepared for them. She told Cecile that Roland had left everything to her: the house, the accounts, and the mill property at Eston Creek. The house was theirs jointly. The accounts were modest, and the mill, she said carefully, had been assessed by the municipal appraiser the previous spring, and the assessed value was, she paused here, as if the number still surprised her, $0. Cecile looked at her for a long moment. She said, "He drove up there every other weekend for 22 years. Francine said, "I know." There was something else in the file. Another document, clipped behind the will, which Francine slid across the desk with a particular deliberateness that Cecile only later understood. It was a notarized agreement, dated 9 years earlier, between Roland Garneau and something called the Eston Creek Community Timber Cooperative. Cecile read the heading twice and still didn't know what she was looking at. She asked what it meant. Francine said she thought Cecile should drive up to the mill first and then come back and ask. She drove up on a Saturday, because she needed the weekday to cry. The road to Thornbury Mill was 12 kilometers of gravel off the main highway, through jack pine and poplar that had turned gold and brown with the late season, the branches hanging low with the weight of the wet snow that had fallen the night before, and hadn't decided yet whether to stay. The smell of the north came through the car's ventilation system even with the windows up. Cold water, pine resin, the particular mineral smell of Canadian shield rock. Cecile had never loved it the way Roland loved it. She had always thought of it as the smell of remoteness. She came around the last bend and stopped the car. She had seen photographs of the mill from Roland's phone, or rather she had seen the photographs he'd shown her, which she understood now might not have been all of them. She had seen the sagging roof and the silted mill pond and the broken wheel, but what she saw now was not entirely that. The mill pond had been cleared. Not perfectly, not commercially, but cleared. The cattails cut back, the surface open and dark, a pair of Canada geese sitting on it with the implacable authority of geese everywhere. The main building's roof had been patched in 2 places with tin sheeting that didn't match but held. The old loading dock that she had seen in photographs as a heap of rotted boards had been rebuilt in rough lumber. Unfinished, but solid. And in the large outbuilding to the left, the one that had been a sorting shed in her grandfather-in-law's time, light was coming through the window. Someone was in there. She sat in the car a minute before she got out. The woman who came to the door of the outbuilding when Cecile knocked was perhaps 30, dark-haired, wearing a canvas work apron over a quilted vest, with sawdust on her forearms and a look of such complete calm that Cecile immediately distrusted it. Her name, she said, was Leah. Just Leah. She said Roland had given her a key to the outbuilding years ago. She said she was sorry about Roland. She said it the way people say things they mean. Cecile asked what she was doing. Leah showed her. The outbuilding had been converted. She didn't know when. Roland had apparently done it in stages over the years, into a working woodshop. Not large, not fancy. A bandsaw, a planer, workbenches made from sawmill offcuts, organized with the same patient neatness that Cecile recognized from Roland's workshop at home. But it was being used. 3 workbenches were occupied with projects in progress. Leia was building a rocking chair. Another bench held the frame of what appeared to be a cradle. A third had cabinet doors laid out for finishing. Cecile stood in the doorway and looked at it. She said, "Who uses this place?" Leia said, "A lot of people. You should talk to Gilles at the hardware in town. He knows all of it better than I do." She drove into Eston Creek, which was not quite a town, more like the memory of one. A main street with a hardware store, a post office, a diner, a Legion Hall with the paint coming off in long curls. The hardware store was called Paquette's, and it was run by a man named Gilles Paquette, who was about 60, barrel-shaped, with hearing aids in both ears, and a way of looking at you like he was waiting to see if you were worth talking to. When she said she was Roland Garneau's wife, he took off his work gloves and put them on the counter and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I wondered when you'd come." Gilles Paquette told her the first part of it over coffee at the diner next door, where the waitress apparently knew his order without being asked. He told her that Roland had started driving up to Eston Creek not, as Cecile had assumed, to putter around an old family property, though he had done that too, but because 8 years ago, Eston Creek had started dying. The mill had been gone for decades. The mine that had kept most families afloat had closed in 2009. Young people left. Old people stayed because they had nowhere to go and no money to get there. The houses aged. The roofs leaked. And there was a particular problem in Eston Creek that Gilles described without drama, the way you describe a thing you've lived with so long it no longer surprises you. The people who needed repairs most were the ones least able to pay for them. Roland Garneau had figured out something about the old mill that nobody else had thought to figure out. The outbuildings were full of salvageable lumber. Decades of it, drying in place, cut and stacked and forgotten. Good lumber, Roland said, when he came to Gilles the first time. Northern white pine and black spruce, the kind you couldn't easily buy anymore. He said he wanted to mill it down and use it. Gilles had said, "Use it for what?" And Roland had said, "For whatever people need." It had started small. Roland and Gilles and 2 other men from town had spent a summer milling the old lumber by hand and stacking it in the outbuilding. The next winter, when the Aucoin family's porch collapsed under the snow load, Roland drove up with a truck full of lumber and spent a long weekend building it back. He didn't invoice anyone. He said it was salvage wood, no material cost. The Aucoin family insisted on paying him something. He said he would put it toward the mill. Word spread the way it spreads in small northern towns. Slowly, person to person, with a kind of careful vetting, as if people needed to establish that the help was real before they let themselves want it. A widow on the east side of town needed her foundation skirting replaced before winter. Done. A young couple who'd bought the old Trottier place and discovered the subfloor was rotten. Roland drove up on a Friday with Leia, who turned out to have grown up in Eston Creek and had come back after art school with no money and no clear plan, and had been apprenticing with Roland for 3 years. Learning joinery the way you learn a language when you're young enough for it to become part of you. The cradle Cecile had seen on the workbench. Roland had built it for a family that couldn't afford to buy one. He'd done maybe 40 of them over the years, Gilles said. He kept the pattern on a folded piece of paper in the top drawer of the workbench, worn soft at the creases. Cecile sat in the diner with her hands around a coffee cup and she listened. And as she listened, she felt a sensation she could not immediately name. A kind of vertigo, as if the floor of a room she'd lived in for 28 years had gently tilted, and nothing was quite where she'd left it. She had believed she was married to a man who chose an old mill over his family's future. She was now being told, gently, carefully, by a man with sawdust in the creases of his hands, that she was married to a man who had spent 8 years quietly rebuilding a dying town with lumber. No one else had thought to value and skill he'd never learned to charge for properly. She thought of the 22 weekends a year. She started doing the arithmetic in her head, the way she always did, automatically. 176 weekends over 8 years. 176 Fridays, he'd loaded the truck and driven north, and she had kissed him at the door, and turned back to whatever she was doing with the particular relief of a woman who has stopped expecting conversation. She asked Gilles if Roland had kept records. Gilles said, You need to see the office. The office was a back room in the outbuilding she hadn't gone into, behind the woodshop, barely larger than a closet. A desk made from a slab of pine on sawhorses, a lamp, a filing cabinet gray, the kind you found in school offices in 1978, and on the desk a series of binders, the cheap, coil-bound kind from any office supply store, labeled in Roland's block printing, which Cecile recognized from 28 years of grocery lists and birthday cards. The binders were organized by year. She opened the first one. Roland had kept records the way a contractor keeps records, systematically, without sentimentality. Each project had a page, address, date, description of work, materials used, itemized in his small, precise handwriting. And at the bottom of each page a single line he had labeled GAM. The Aucoin porch held the snow load this winter, they're all right. The Trottier subfloor. 2 kids now, floors sound. She turned the page, and then another. And then she sat down on the floor of that little room, which was the only thing her legs would agree to, and she read. There was a page for an elderly man named Armand, who had lived alone in a house with a roof, so compromised he was sleeping in his kitchen because it was the only room that didn't leak. Roland had re-roofed it over 2 weekends in June. The outcome note said, "Armand is back in his bedroom," he cried. I pretended not to notice. There was a page for a family that had lost their house in a fire, not a rebuild. Roland had helped them gut and restore the shell of what remained, which a municipality had been about to condemn. The outcome note said, they stayed. 3 kids. The oldest one wants to be a carpenter. There was a page, she nearly missed it, near the back of an older binder, for a young man named Michel who had appeared at the mill one April with no particular plan, who Roland had described only as in a rough spot, not talking much. The project description was, built a workbench together, showed him mortise and tenon. The outcome note, 3 lines below, said, Michel came back the next Friday and the one after. He's got steady hands, he doesn't need to talk if he doesn't want to. Cecile held that page for a long time. She thought of all the times Roland had come home with that look on his face. The one she'd given up trying to read. And she understood now that the look was not blankness. It was the look of a man full of things he couldn't explain without sounding like he was asking to be praised, and who had decided a long time ago that praise was not the point. She had thought his silence was indifference. She had been wrong about what he was saving it for. Before we go further, and what comes next is the part of this story that floored us when we first learned it. We want to ask you something. Is there someone in your life who gave quietly, so quietly you only understood it later? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone, and if you're watching this for the first time, hit subscribe now, because the next part of Cecile's story is the part that changes everything. Now, back to that filing cabinet. There was one drawer she hadn't opened. The bottom one. It was heavier than the others, and when she finally pulled it free, she understood why. Inside were envelopes. Not filed, not organized, just sitting in the drawer the way things sit when they arrive steadily over years, and there's no better system than simply keeping them. There were letters. She took them to the desk and opened them one by one. They were from people whose names she did not know, written over the span of years, addressed to Roland at the mill's rural route address. Some were in French, some in English, some in a mixture of both the way Northern Ontario people write when they're being most sincere. Many of them were short, a few were very long. A woman named Danielle had written to say that the rocking chair Roland built for her mother's room at the care home had been there when her mother died, and that her mother had touched the armrest every single day and called it the good chair, and that she wanted Roland to know that. A man named Curtis, in handwriting that went sideways up the page, had written, "You probably don't remember me. 14 years ago you helped me replace the window casings on the house on Birch Road. I wasn't doing well that year. You didn't ask about it. You just showed me how to set the casing level and let me do it myself. I've been a Finnish carpenter for 12 years now. I thought you should know." There was a card, a Christmas card, one of the cheap foil ones from a dollar store. From a child, it said, "Dear Mr. Roland, thank you for making my bed. It doesn't squeak anymore. From Isabel, age 9. He had kept them all. Cecile arranged them by postmark on the pine slab desk, her bookkeeper's hands doing it automatically, and when she stepped back and looked at the full spread of them, 20, 30, she lost count. She realized she was looking at something Roland had never shown her. Not because he was hiding it, not because he was ashamed, but because, to Roland, showing her would have turned a gift into an accomplishment, and he was constitutionally unable to mistake those two things for each other. She sat with those letters until the light through the outbuilding's small window had gone orange, and then gray, and the geese on the mill pond had stopped their noise, and the temperature had dropped enough that she could see her breath. Then she cried. Not from grief exactly, or not only from grief. She cried from the particular ache of understanding something too late, of having lived for 28 years in a house with a man who was quietly extraordinary, and having been too preoccupied with the columns that didn't balance to look up and see it. She did not stay in grief long. She was a billing clerk. She was practical by nature, and there was a document downstairs she still hadn't understood, and understanding it felt now, somehow like the thing Roland would have wanted her to do next. She drove back to Sudbury the next morning and sat down across from Francine Bellehumeur and put the notarized agreement on the desk and said, "Explain it to me from the beginning." Francine explained it slowly, because she was a woman who had spent 50 years explaining things to people at their worst moments, and she had learned that slowness was not condescension. It was courtesy. Years ago, Roland Garneau had walked into this same office with a particular concern. A resource company, she didn't remember the name, some forestry subsidiary, had been circling the Eston Creek region, looking for timber rights on private land. The mill's 12 acres included second-growth stands that hadn't been touched in 30 years. Roland had understood, with the instinct of a man who paid attention to what things were worth beneath their appraised value, that the land might one day look attractive to someone with money and a legal team. He had done something about it. The agreement he had signed was a formal land use covenant registered with the Provincial Land Registry. The mill property at Eston Creek had been placed, by Roland Garneau's own hand, under a permanent community timber trust. The 12 acres could not be sold to a commercial interest. The timber could not be harvested for profit. The property was bound in perpetuity to serve the residents of Eston Creek as a source of non-commercial building materials and a site for community trades education. It was irrevocable. Cecile sat with that word. "He could have told me," she said. Francine was quiet for a moment. Then she said something she had clearly been deciding whether to say. She said that Roland had actually mentioned Cecile. When he came in to sign the papers 9 years ago, he had said, and Francine read it from a note she'd made at the time, in the margin of the file, "Cecile would carry this alone if she had to. She's strong enough. But I don't want her to have to fight it by herself. I want it settled before there's anything to fight." Cecile looked at the wall behind Francine's desk for a long time. She had spent years believing that Roland's attachment to that mill was a preference, that he had chosen a falling-down building over his family's security, that he had prioritized an old inheritance over the real and present needs of a real and present wife. She had never said it in those exact words. She had found quieter ways to carry it, but he had known. He had known she would be the one left to deal with it, and he had spent 9 years quietly, making sure the dealing would be simple. He had not told her because telling her would have made it a weight. She would have worried about the legal particulars, asked questions, tried to improve it. He wanted her to simply be protected, without having to know she was being protected. She drove north again the following weekend, and this time she stayed 3 days. The news that Roland Garneau's wife had come to the mill, and was staying, moved through Eston Creek in the quiet way of northern towns, where nobody announces anything but everybody knows. By the second morning, people came. The first was the man from the funeral, the one with the muddy work boots. His name was Sylvain Cote, and he was a logger in his 50s who had grown up in Eston Creek and never left, and who had been, he said without ornamentation, Roland's first project, not a building project, himself. He had been drinking badly for 2 years after the mine closed, and Roland had hired him. That was the word Sylvain used, hired, though Cecile later understood that no money had changed hands, to help salvage the old lumber from the outbuildings. 6 months of physical work in the open air with a man who didn't ask questions had apparently done what nothing else had managed to do. Sylvain had been sober for 7 years. He came every weekend now to help with whatever needed doing. He apologized for leaving the funeral early. He said he'd needed air. Then came an older couple, the Allets, whose kitchen floor Roland had relaid 3 winters ago when the original had become unsafe. They brought a pie because they had not known what else to bring. Then came Leah, who sat at the workbench and was quiet for a while, and then said that Roland had found her at a moment, 4 years ago, when she was not entirely sure she wanted to continue, and that he hadn't made a project of helping her. He had simply made a project and included her in it. and that was its own kind of saving. Cecile listened to all of them, and each story rearranged something in her chest, gentle and irreversible like vertebrae, finding their right position after years slightly out of alignment. She had thought she knew the shape of her marriage. She had been measuring it wrong. The company arrived in early December. There were two of them in an expensive leased truck. A man named Thierry Fontaine from a firm called Boreal Capital Properties, and a junior colleague who was there to take notes and look serious. Fontaine was about 45, polished in the way of a man who has spent his career in rooms where being polished is mistaken for being right. He shook Cecile's hand with the calibrated warmth of someone who had learned warmth as a professional tool. He said he was very sorry about her husband. He said his company had been interested in the Eston Creek corridor for some time. Good second-growth timber, reasonable road access, and they had some projections he'd love to walk her through. He had a number for the land, he said. A real number, not the municipal assessment. He handed her a folder. Cecile looked at the number. She was a billing clerk. She knew exactly what that number could do. It could pay off the house. It could fund 15 years of retirement without anxiety. It could replace the $61.40 in her wallet with something that felt. If you were a certain kind of tired like safety. She could feel Fontaine watching her read it the way he adjusted his weight slightly. The particular stillness of a man who believed the next 60 seconds were going to go his way. She closed the folder. She said, "Did your people look at the title?" The junior colleague's pen stopped moving. Fontaine said they had done a preliminary review. He said it in the smooth way of a man who has not actually done the thing he's claiming to have done. Cecile said, "There's a community timber trust registered with the provincial registry. Dated 9 years ago. Permanent covenant. The land can't be transferred to a commercial interest. The timber can't be harvested for profit, and no mechanism exists to dissolve the trust short of unanimous consent of the registered community beneficiaries, which is, at this point, roughly 43 families in Eston Creek." She paused. "I had a lawyer look at it this week." Fontaine was quiet. He was not a cruel man. That was the thing she kept thinking afterward, the same way she'd thought it about no one in particular, without a face to put to it, while sitting in Roland's records room. Fontaine was a man who had spent his entire career accurately appraising things, and who had never, not once, been in a room with something that couldn't be appraised. He didn't have the vocabulary for it. He tried a few more angles. He talked about partial acquisition, about easement amendments, about whether the trust had been properly registered under the current provincial framework. Cecile let him talk because she had learned in 28 years of medical billing that people need to finish saying the thing they came to say before they can hear the thing you need to tell them. When he stopped, she said, "My husband spent 8 years building something in this town out of wood that everyone else had written off as worthless. He didn't do it to own anything. He did it so that no one in this town would have to go without because they couldn't pay. And then he spent 9 years making sure that no one, regardless of how much money they had or how good their lawyers were, would be able to undo it after he was gone." She looked at the folder, still closed on the desk between them. "He left me a mill that the county assessed at 0, but he measured it differently, and I've decided he measured right." Fontaine picked up the folder. He said he'd be in touch. He said it in the voice of a man who knows he won't be. He drove away down the gravel road, and Cecile stood in the door of the outbuilding watching until the truck disappeared into the jackpine, and Leah came and stood beside her, and they didn't say anything because there was nothing that needed saying. The Boreal Capital offer disappeared. A different company looked at the parcel 2 years later, but Cecile had had the covenant reviewed by a property lawyer in Toronto by then. And the answer was the same. The trust held. It would always hold. Roland had built it to hold. Spring came late to Eston Creek, the way it comes late to all of northern Ontario, reluctantly, incrementally, with false starts that leave you foolish for having believed in them. But then 1 week in May it came all at once. The poplars going green overnight, the mill pond losing its last skim of ice, the geese returning and immediately acting as though they had never left. Cecile had gone back to Sudbury for the winter, because she was not ready to be in Eston Creek through the cold months. She had her job, her routines, the particular geography of a life she had built. But in April she had given her notice at the hospital. She was 53. She had the house, she had a modest pension, and she had a mill. She drove north on the first weekend of May with her car full of things, and she opened the outbuilding, and she sat down at Roland's pine slab desk, and she opened the newest binder. The one for the current year, with mostly blank pages, and she found the last entry he had made. It was dated the Friday before the Wednesday he died. A porch railing for a family named Trottier-Hebert, the adult children of the couple, whose subfloor Roland had fixed years ago. The outcome column was half finished. Roland had written, "Railing set and solid, should last," and then the sentence stopped, mid-thought, because he had died the following Wednesday, and the sentence had been waiting there unfinished ever since. Cecile sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up the pen. She wrote the date. She wrote what she had done that weekend. Not a building project, just clearing leaves from the mill pond edge, resetting a loose board on the loading dock, sitting with Leah while she finished the rocking chair and asking her to explain the joint she was cutting, learning how to see what Roland had seen in a piece of wood, how to read where it wanted to go. She was not a carpenter. She was a woman who had spent her career making columns balance, but she was learning that some things cannot be made to balance, and that this is not the same as being wrong. Some ledgers are not meant to close. Sylvain came that weekend, and Gilles, and two young men from town who Leah was teaching, and an older woman named Berthe, who had never touched a tool in her life, but had brought sandwiches and stayed to watch and then stayed to help sand. And the outbuilding was full of the smell of pine shavings and coffee, and the sound of work being done without urgency, at the pace of people who have chosen to be somewhere. Cecile stood in the doorway at one point and watched them. These people who had loved her husband in the quiet way of people who are given something without being asked to be grateful for it. She had spent 28 years waiting to be let into what Roland was, and here she was, finally in the room. The county assessor came back the following summer, part of a regional property review. He walked the land, made notes, wrote a number. Zero again because the covenant meant no commercial value could be assigned. He apologized for it the way people apologize for mathematics. Cecile said she understood completely. She said a piece of land can be appraised at zero. She said she'd been married to a man who understood that perfectly, better than anyone, and who had spent 28 years proving that the things which register as zero on a balance sheet are frequently the things you cannot put a price on. The assessor wrote it down. She didn't think he understood what she meant. That was all right. Not everyone would. That December, Cecile brought the binders down from the shelf one afternoon when the outbuilding was empty, and she was alone with the lamp, and the smell of cedar and the quiet. She laid them on the workbench and she read through them slowly, all of them, from the first entry to the one she had written herself. She read Armand, who got his bedroom back. She read Curtis, who became a carpenter. She read Isabelle, age 9, whose bed no longer squeaked. She read the word Roland had written the 7 times, across all the years, when a project had not gone the way he'd hoped. Not failed. He never wrote failed. He wrote not enough time. Because to Roland, failure was a judgment on the work, and the work had always been sound. It was only time that had been short. She closed the last binder. Outside, Leah had come up from town, and was climbing the short ladder to the outbuilding's exterior light. A proper fixture now, on a timer, installed by Gilles the previous fall, to keep the loading dock lit through the winter, so that anyone who arrived at the mill in the dark would know it was open, would know someone was there. Cecile watched her light come on. It was a practical light. Roland would have been the first to say so. It kept people from tripping. It told you where the door was. But standing there in the yellow rectangle it threw onto the snow, watching Leah come back down the ladder and dust her hands. Cecile thought about all the things that looked like practicality from the outside, and were something else entirely from the inside. A man driving 3 hours every other Friday because there were people who needed what he knew how to give. A covenant signed 9 years ago, so that his wife would never have to stand alone in a room and be offered a number for something that had no number. A sentence left unfinished in a binder, waiting for someone to pick up the pen. She went inside and picked up the pen. She wrote the date. She wrote what the light was doing on the snow. She wrote Leah's name. She wrote that the mill pond had frozen early this year, and the geese had already gone south, and that the 2 young men Leah was teaching had started coming on their own now, without being asked, on Tuesday evenings, because apparently that was when they felt like it. She wrote that she had been wrong about a great many things for a long time, and that being wrong about them was the most important thing that had ever happened to her. She wrote that she intended to keep the binders going, that she intended to keep the outbuilding open, that she intended to learn, slowly and badly at first, how to do the things Roland had done, or enough of them that Leah and Sylvain and the Tuesday evening boys could do the rest. She wrote, Cecile Garneau, keeping the record for Roland Garneau. Don't let the lamp go out. There's always one more project. There's always one more name. She set down the pen. Through the outbuilding window, the light stayed on over the loading dock, throwing its steady yellow reach out across the snow and the frozen mill pond and the dark jack pine. And if you had come up the gravel road that night, not knowing the story, not knowing anything about Roland Garneau or the 22 years, or the 43 families, or the binders on the shelf, if you had come up the road with nothing but cold hands and a problem you didn't know how to fix, you would have seen that light and known that this was a place where someone was in, and the door was open, and whatever you needed, you could at least come in from the cold and ask. That is what Roland Garneau left his wife. Not a mill, not 12 acres, not a legal covenant, though it was all of those things too. He left her a light that was still on,